I still remember the day Rena vanished. The weather was stifling, the sky a blazing blue ceiling with no trace of mercy. I was in my late 20s at the time, and I'd been dating my girlfriend Carmen for almost 2 years. Her sister Rena was the kind of person who radiated optimism even in the darkest moments. She had that easy smile and a knack for finding reasons to laugh at life's absurdities. When I look back on everything that happened, the abduction, the trial, and what's happened to me since, it feels like some twisted screenplay I've been forced to star in. That July afternoon, Rena was supposed to meet Carmen for a late lunch. Instead, she was snatched away by a group of 6 men. The police investigation was swift, and the entire community was on edge. Local news anchors plastered Rena's photograph everywhere, her smiling face a tragic reminder of how fast innocence can be stolen. Everyone clung to hope that she'd be found safe. Then, less than 2 days later, authorities confirmed the worst. Rena had been killed. The men responsible were arrested within a week, but that offered no relief to anyone in Carmen's family. From that point on, something tore loose in all of us. A fog settled over Carmen's parents, Mr. Gabriel and Mrs. Teresa. Their once warm household turned into a mausoleum of hushed sobs and drawn curtains. After the funeral, which took place just 3 months ago, it was as if time decided to creep forward in half measures. Carmen tried to press on, burying herself in her work as a nurse at the local hospital, while I attempted to be her rock. Despite my best efforts, I felt that I was sinking too, a slow descent into guilt and sorrow because I'd been powerless to help. On the day it all began, or at least the day I became aware that there was more to Rena's death than we could ever have imagined, I showed up at Carmen's parents' house to wait for her shift to end. It was a bright October afternoon, the kind where the leaves are slowly curling into shades of gold and red. The yard was quiet and the driveway empty. Mr. Gabriel and Mrs. Teresa had gone out of town for some medical appointments, leaving the house devoid of its usual clamor. I stepped inside, using the spare key Carmen had given me. The interior felt cooler than I remembered, almost chilly. I brushed it off as simply autumn's slow creep. Setting my keys on the hall table, I made my way into the family room, where the furniture still bore signs of neglect. Threadbare cushions, a faint mustiness from weeks of little use. In a bid to forget the tension, I flicked on the TV. Aimless channel surfing led me to an old sitcom rerun. I settled onto the couch, letting my body sink into the worn cushions. For a moment, I thought about Rena, her last moments, the funeral, and the grief that had nearly paralyzed Carmen's parents. My brain pulsed with a sharp pang of loss. I tried shaking it off by focusing on the show, but the sitcom's canned laughter only heightened the sense of emptiness. Suddenly, I heard it. Landon. My name, as clear as day, whispered in my right ear. The voice was so close it was as though someone leaned in from just behind my shoulder to get my attention. But the tone was unmistakable. Soft, lilting, almost breathy. It was Rena's voice. Confusion didn't give me pause. It gave me a jolt. The remote tumbled from my hand, clattering on the hardwood floor. Instinctively, I jerked my head to the right, fully expecting to see Rena smiling at me the way she used to whenever she'd catch me off guard. The couch beside me was empty. Of course it was empty. Rena was gone. My logical mind shouted that I had imagined it. Maybe I dozed off. Maybe my grief was playing tricks on me. But my heart hammered so hard that each beat felt like a drum slam in my ears. I stared at that vacant cushion, trying to force some sense into the moment. My mind raced through all the usual excuses: stress, exhaustion, my own sadness. Yet the voice was so distinct. I hadn't misheard. I replayed it in my thoughts. Yes, it sounded exactly like her. Warm, curious, and just a tad mischievous. My entire body bristled with goosebumps, cold sweat beading along my hairline. Gradually, the sitcom's laughter in the background transformed into a grating hum, like a swarm of static. My breathing grew uneven, ragged. I realized that no matter how insane it seemed, I had heard Rena's voice. I needed to do something, anything, to break the tension. With shaking hands, I reached for the remote and turned off the TV. The screen went dark, the family room falling silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen. I sat there, transfixed by that silent cushion, the spot where Rena had once loved to sprawl out during family movie nights. Part of me wanted to call out to her. Another part recoiled in fear. After what felt like an eternity, I stood up, nerves humming like they were wired to an electric current. Something about that place felt too oppressive. The walls seemed to close in, and the air felt thicker, heavier. I decided it would be better to wait outside until Carmen got home. I reasoned that fresh air would clear my mind. Maybe I'd see a passerby or a neighbor, and that'd be enough to remind me I was anchored in the real world, not lost in some supernatural delirium. I practically ran to the front door, stepping onto the wide porch. The autumn sun was setting, painting the sky in orange and violet streaks. A gentle breeze rustled through the maple tree out front, carrying the scent of damp leaves. The porch swing squeaked softly, stirred by the breeze. I lowered myself onto it, hands clammy and trembling. I could still feel the ghost of that voice trailing in my ear. Was it a hallucination? A manifestation of my own stress and guilt? The rational side of me insisted it was just my mind playing cruel tricks. Yet something else, a primal, uneasy feeling, suggested there was more. After all, the entire family had been shattered by Rena's loss. Maybe her spirit was trying to reach out to us. As the daylight ebbed, a chill settled in. My eyes kept drifting to the front window of the family room where I'd been sitting only moments before. Nothing moved inside, no silhouettes. But I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched, that if I turned away for too long, a face might appear at the glass. The longer I sat there, the more the quiet took on a sinister edge. Even the distant sound of a passing car made me flinch. After about 20 minutes, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Carmen. "Running a little late, emergency patient, be home soon." I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I told her I'd wait for her, leaving out the part about hearing Rena's voice. How was I supposed to bring that up? There was a chance it would break Carmen even more. The sun dipped fully below the horizon, leaving a faint afterglow. I glanced at my reflection in the living room window, a distorted silhouette caught between dying light and creeping darkness. A pang of unease hit me again, the hair on my arms standing upright. That voice in my ear refused to fade from my memory. It was as if Rena herself was standing behind me, urging me not to dismiss it. Gripping the edge of the porch swing, I made a promise to myself. If I heard it again, I wouldn't run. Maybe I'd respond, or at least try to. If Rena's spirit was truly here, if she had something to say, I had to listen. The alternative was to pretend I was losing my mind, but I already felt like I was teetering on that edge, and ignoring it wouldn't help. I leaned back and tried to steady my breathing. The house behind me seemed to resonate with a strange, silent energy. The wind stirred again, making the old porch boards creak. Something was different. Something had been set into motion that afternoon. I suspected this was just the beginning of an encounter that would change my understanding of life and death forever. Just then, the porch light flickered above me, as if acknowledging my silent vow. I found myself unable to tear my gaze from the darkened window. Part of me expected a shadow to glide across, maybe a flash of movement. But nothing came. Instead, I only felt a haunting emptiness, and that was somehow worse. I had no idea what the night had in store. Carmen's car finally pulled into the driveway about half an hour later. Relief washed over me, as though she'd driven away the menacing shadows by simply arriving. She swung the driver's side door open and smiled wearily, her eyes rimmed with the exhaustion of a long hospital shift. I stood from the porch swing, trying to compose myself so my disquiet wouldn't alarm her. But I must have looked pale because her smile faded the moment she laid eyes on me. "Landon, are you okay?" she asked, voice laced with concern. I hesitated, unsure if I should confess what had happened. Instead, I mustered a nod and forced a half smile. "Just tired," I offered lamely. She didn't look convinced, but she was too drained to press further. We both headed inside. Entering that house again felt like stepping into a chilled crypt. I turned on the hallway light, hoping the warmth of the bulb would banish any unsettling vibes. Carmen tossed her purse onto an armchair, flipping through the mail that her parents had left on the side table. She noticed the television remote lying on the floor and raised an eyebrow. "Were you watching something?" she asked, leaning down to pick it up. "Yeah, just an old show," I replied, taking the remote from her a bit too quickly. My mind drifted back to that vivid voice, Rena's voice, and my stomach twisted. I prayed Carmen wouldn't notice my trembling grip. We settled in the kitchen to scrounge up a late dinner. Carmen checked the fridge, finding half a roast chicken and some leftovers. The normalcy of domestic tasks almost lulled me into believing everything would be fine. Almost. But as I warmed the food in the microwave, a shiver ran through me, like a subtle reminder that something dark had staked a claim on this space. We ate quietly at the small round table. I could tell Carmen wanted to talk about Rena. She always did. But she also seemed to sense that I was on edge. So we focused on mundane topics. Her shift at the hospital, the unusual dryness of the fall weather, whether or not we should see a movie that weekend. Still, the tension was palpable. It was in her sighs, in the way I tapped my fork against the plate, in every glance that darted to the door of the family room. When we finished, I offered to wash the dishes. Carmen stood behind me, arms wrapped around her torso as if cold. "Thanks," she murmured. "I'm going to go change. Be right back." I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway toward her old bedroom. The sound put me on alert for reasons I couldn't articulate. The running water from the tap was the only noise in the house, yet it felt deafening in the silence. I found myself listening for something else, something out of place. Then it happened again, but differently. A faint shuffle from the family room, like fabric against upholstery. My heart kicked into overdrive. I turned off the faucet, listening intently. Another soft sound, almost like a whisper of movement. Slowly, I set the dish towel down and inched toward the family room doorway. The room was dim, lit only by the hallway's glow. My gaze landed on the couch, the same spot where I'd heard Rena's voice earlier. The shape of the cushions was normal, no indentations or signs of someone sitting there. I scanned the rest of the space. The old recliner, the coffee table, the TV with a faint reflection of me in it. Nothing. Yet the sensation of being watched clung to me like a second skin. My temples throbbed. I swallowed hard, determined not to bolt for the porch again. If this was indeed Rena, I wanted to show her I wasn't afraid. But who was I kidding? Fear pulsed in every cell of my body. Rena, I found myself whispering, my voice fragile. Is that you? For several heartbeats, there was no reply. The only sound was Carmen's muffled footsteps as she moved around in the bedroom. I felt a twinge of embarrassment calling out to an empty room, and then I heard a gasp, a soft, muted inhalation, like someone was startled. The sound seemed to come from near the corner of the couch. My breath hitched, but I forced myself to step closer. Suddenly, Carmen's voice came from behind, startling me. "Landon, what are you doing?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. My hand flew to my chest in reflex. "Nothing," I stammered, turning to face her. She stood in the hallway, wearing sweats and an oversized t-shirt, her brow furrowed. "Are you sure you're all right? You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, a weak attempt at humor. I forced a chuckle, though it sounded hollow even to me. Just thought I heard something. Carmen's eyes flicked around the room. For a second, I considered telling her everything, how I'd heard her sister's voice, how I felt this bizarre presence watching me from the shadows. But how could I lay that on her? She was already carrying enough grief and trauma. Instead, I shook my head, plastering on a feeble smile. "Maybe it's just the pipes," I lied. "This house is old." She didn't look convinced, but she also didn't push. "Okay," she said softly. "I'm going to put on some tea. Maybe it'll help us both relax." Without another word, she turned and headed back to the kitchen. I stood there feeling foolish and unsettled. I knew I wasn't imagining things. I'd heard that gasp clear as day. My thoughts raced. If Rena's spirit was truly trying to communicate, did that mean she was trapped here, in this house full of sorrow? Or was something else wearing her voice like a disguise? A creeping sense of dread overtook me at the latter thought. I eventually rejoined Carmen in the kitchen. She'd boiled water and placed 2 mugs on the table, steam curling in the air. We sipped the tea in silence. I could tell she sensed a tension, and I felt torn between telling her everything and sparing her the discomfort. The last thing I wanted was to resurface her anguish over Rena's murder, especially if it turned out I was just cracking under stress. After we finished our tea, Carmen flicked through the channels on TV in an effort to lighten the mood. We ended up half watching a cooking show, neither of us really paying attention. The hours inched forward. Eventually, Carmen suggested we get some rest. Her old bedroom still had a double bed, and we planned to stay the night since her parents wouldn't be home till morning. We made our way down the hall, passing the family photos that lined the walls, pictures of Carmen, Rena, and their parents during happier times. My footsteps slowed when I noticed one specific photo. Rena at the beach, beaming at the camera while holding a giant seashell to her ear. The memory struck me like a hammer to the chest. She'd once joked that she could hear the ocean's secrets in that shell. I wondered if now, in some twisted cosmic irony, she was the one trying to whisper secrets to us. Carmen reached for my hand, as though sensing the emotional storm swirling inside me. "Let's get some sleep," she whispered. I nodded numbly, following her into the dim bedroom. We changed into our pajamas, the only light coming from a small lamp near the closet. I crawled under the covers, lying awake as Carmen's breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. My mind refused to settle. The quiet pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. I couldn't stop replaying that voice, that airy gasp. Every creak of the old house made me flinch. At times I swore I heard faint footsteps in the hall, but I forced myself to stay put. Eventually, exhaustion weighed me down enough that sleep managed to claim me. That night, I dreamed of Rena standing in the family room. Her eyes brimmed with urgency, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Then, behind her, something loomed. Tall, dark, its shape impossible to pin down. Its presence exuded a silent menace. I tried to reach for Rena, to pull her away from whatever that thing was, but my feet felt rooted to the floor, my arms heavy. Helpless, I watched as a gnarled shadow hand stretched toward her shoulder. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering. Carmen slept peacefully beside me. The moonlight through the window cast long, eerie shapes across the floor. Swallowing hard, I glanced at the crack under the door, half expecting to see a shifting shadow. Nothing, just darkness. But something was undeniably in motion, unseen yet present. And it was only a matter of time before I would no longer be able to hide it from Carmen or myself. The next morning arrived with an overcast sky that seemed to reflect the mood of the house. Carmen and I shared a brief, tired exchange. She asked if I'd slept well. I muttered something about restless dreams. Neither of us mentioned Rena or ghosts or anything supernatural over breakfast. We simply nibbled on toast and sipped coffee like strangers in a hotel lobby. Around mid-morning, her parents, Mr. Gabriel and Mrs. Teresa, returned. The front door opened, and I caught the glimmer of hope in their eyes when they saw us, likely expecting some normalcy by having young people around. But the weight of Rena's loss seemed etched into every line on their faces. Mr. Gabriel's once booming voice had softened to a weary rumble, and Mrs. Teresa moved as though each step pained her. Carmen and I greeted them, offering help with their luggage. They insisted they were fine. Despite the polite small talk, a somber undertone lingered. Mrs. Teresa asked if we'd been comfortable overnight. Carmen smiled politely, while I offered a quick nod, hoping they wouldn't notice my unease. The day stretched on, each minute feeling elongated by tension. Carmen planned to spend time with her mom to go over some errands. Mr. Gabriel mentioned needing to fix a leak in the upstairs bathroom. I decided I'd tidy up the family room. It felt like the least I could do. Truthfully, I needed to confront that space in daylight, to see if it still held that eerie presence. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I started picking up magazines and repositioning cushions. My mind wandered to the memory of hearing Rena's voice, the gasp, and the disturbing dream. Even in broad daylight, my skin prickled. That's when I discovered something that made my heart lurch. Beneath the coffee table, I found a small earring, a single stud with a tiny pearl. I recognized it as one of Rena's. She wore those pearl studs every day, a gift from her grandmother. I didn't recall seeing it there before, and it struck me as odd because Carmen's parents had vacuumed and cleaned repeatedly after the funeral, trying to rid the home of painful reminders. I held the earring in my palm, a wave of sadness crushing me. Why was it here now? Could it have been wedged under the couch or table all this time, only to resurface? Or did it appear for a reason? An irrational part of me wondered if this was another sign, Rena leaving something behind to catch my attention. Gently, I placed the earring on the coffee table, planning to give it to Carmen later. I resumed tidying, wiping down surfaces, fluffing cushions, anything to keep my mind from drifting into darker corners. I even tried humming a tune under my breath, though it did little to chase away the underlying dread. Around noon, Carmen and her mom decided to run some errands in town, leaving me and Mr. Gabriel alone in the house. I heard the upstairs sink running, accompanied by the clank of tools as he tinkered away at the leak. Eventually, I settled onto the couch with a glass of water, thinking a bit of TV background noise might help. I flipped through stations, searching for something, anything, that wasn't about crime or horror. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me, slow and deliberate. Mr. Gabriel must be heading downstairs, I thought. But a quick glance toward the stairwell revealed no one. The footsteps sounded closer now, like they were just at the threshold of the family room. My heart jumped. Carefully, I set the remote down and turned my head. The hallway was empty. I rose from the couch, each muscle tensed. "Mr. Gabriel?" I called, my voice echoing slightly. No response. The only sound was the distant drip of the faucet upstairs. My own pulse throbbed in my ears. A swirl of dust motes caught the sunlight near the hallway, drifting lazily as though mocking my anxiety. I decided to check upstairs, taking the steps two at a time. The hallway carpet felt soft under my feet, muffling my steps. I found Mr. Gabriel in the bathroom, crouched over the sink, a wrench in hand. He glanced up, startled by my sudden presence. "Oh, Landon," he said. "Everything all right?" "Did you just come downstairs?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He looked genuinely confused. "No, I've been here the whole time." A chill ran through me. Must have heard something else," I muttered, forcing a small smile. He nodded and returned to his work. I retreated back to the family room, my thoughts churning. The house was playing tricks on me, or something in it was. I grabbed my phone to distract myself, scrolling through news feeds mindlessly. A headline about the men who had murdered Rena scrolled past. One of them was apparently trying to appeal his conviction, but the article was short on details. My stomach turned. I locked my phone and tossed it aside. Just then, a soft clang echoed from the kitchen, like a pot lid dropping. I froze, listening. Mr. Gabriel was still upstairs, and Mrs. Teresa and Carmen were out. Summoning courage, I made my way to the kitchen. The sight that greeted me was perplexing. One of the cabinet doors was slightly ajar, and a saucepan lay on the floor. Nothing else was disturbed. Steeling my nerves, I walked over and picked up the saucepan. The bottom felt cool, no reason for it to have fallen by itself unless it had been improperly balanced. Yet we hadn't cooked anything in that particular pot for days. A knot formed in my gut. It was too coincidental. Something was trying to get my attention, or rattle my nerves. I set the saucepan back in place, carefully closing the cabinet. A dull headache pulsed at my temples. I went to the sink and splashed water on my face, glimpsing my reflection in the window above the sink. My eyes were tired, my expression haunted. I dried my face and inhaled slowly, willing myself to remain calm. I'd promised myself if Rena made contact again, I wouldn't run. But what if this wasn't Rena? My mind reeled at the possibility that something darker might be at play. Footsteps on the porch signaled Carmen and Mrs. Teresa's return. Relief coursed through me, though I tried to mask it with casual indifference. They came in carrying grocery bags, and I rushed over to help. Mrs. Teresa gave me a grateful smile, but her eyes flickered with concern. "You all right, Landon?" she asked softly, echoing Carmen's question from last night. I forced a bright nod. "Yeah, fine. Just a little headache. Maybe allergies." Carmen's gaze lingered on me, but she said nothing. We put the groceries away, and the rest of the afternoon unfolded in an almost normal way. Mr. Gabriel emerged from the bathroom triumphant, boasting he had finally fixed the drip. Mrs. Teresa asked Carmen for help with a soup recipe for dinner. I drifted between them, still feeling on edge, but determined to appear useful. In a spare moment, I discreetly handed Carmen the pearl earring I had found. She recognized it instantly, tears pooling in her eyes. I don't know how this got here," she whispered. I swallowed hard, patting her arm gently, neither of us able to say more. By the time evening rolled around, the four of us were seated at the dining table, sharing a quiet meal of chicken soup and bread. It was modest but comforting. The conversation stayed polite and minimal. Health updates, weather complaints, the usual. Nobody mentioned Rena, but her absence loomed over every spoonful. After dinner, Carmen and I decided to take a short walk around the neighborhood. The crisp fall air brushed our skin as we wandered past dimly lit houses and piles of raked leaves. At one point, Carmen paused under a street lamp, her gaze drifting to me. "Something's been bothering you," she said, her tone gentle but insistent. "I can feel it. This house. It's unsettling, isn't it?" I hesitated, scanning the quiet street for eavesdroppers. Finally, I nodded. "Yes, I've been seeing and hearing things." My voice was barely above a whisper. I think it might be Rena, or her spirit, or I don't know." Carmen's eyes welled. "I felt things too," she admitted. "I sometimes sense she's right there, just out of sight. But I never know if it's wishful thinking." I gently squeezed her hand. "We'll figure it out, together." She exhaled shakily, looking both relieved and frightened. We resumed our walk, uncertain of what might come next, but sharing a determined resolve to uncover the truth of whatever was lurking in that house. When we returned, the lights in the family room were off, and a single lamp in the hallway illuminated the darkness. The quiet was thick, like a blanket of silence wrapped too tightly around the home. Carmen and I exchanged a knowing look before heading to our respective nighttime routines. Even though we'd finally admitted to each other that something was happening, neither of us had a clue how to address it. Yet deep down, I knew this was only the start. We had opened a door, perhaps not literally, but spiritually, and there was no telling what might come through. That night, I struggled to sleep again. Every creak in the old house amplified my anxiety. Carmen, beside me, tossed and turned, mumbling incoherent words in her dreams. Occasionally, her brow furrowed, and I wondered if she was seeing the same dark visions I had. Around midnight, I drifted into a light doze, only to be yanked awake by a sound outside the bedroom door. It was a soft moan, mournful and drawn out. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering. I listened, straining my ears, but the sound didn't repeat. Carmen didn't stir. Unsure whether I'd actually heard something or just dreamt it, I slid out of bed. The hallway was barely lit by the glow of the street lamp filtering through a window at the far end. My throat felt dry. I wasn't sure if I should investigate or crawl back into bed. But the moan had felt so real. Summoning courage, I moved silently toward the family room again. The space was deserted, bathed in thin moonlight. The couch looked strangely menacing in the half-dark. My gaze locked on the cushion where I'd heard Rena's voice that first day. The memory sent a shiver through me. I walked into the center of the room, each footstep echoing on the hardwood. "Rena?" I whispered, voice trembling. "Is that you?" No response, just the hush of the house. And yet, the air felt charged, as if the atmosphere itself was brimming with tension. I could sense a presence, intangible but palpable. I recalled the dream of Rena and that looming shadow. My stomach twisted at the possibility that something sinister might be attached to her memory. Then, from the far corner of the room near the old recliner, came a soft sound. A single, sharp inhale, like someone gasping for breath. I froze, my pulse roaring in my ears. Was it the wind sneaking through a crack in the window? Or a real human voice? It occurred to me that I might be dangerously close to losing my grip on reality. With trembling hands, I fumbled for the lamp switch. Light flooded the room, chasing away the shadows. Nothing was there, of course. My heart sank with both relief and disappointment. If Rena was trying to contact us, why these cryptic noises instead of something more direct? If something else was here, why was it toying with me? Suddenly, behind me, there was a rapid knock on the window. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The window curtains were drawn, but the silhouette of a shape flickered, then vanished. Summoning what little bravery I had, I pulled the curtain aside and peered out. The yard was empty, only the faint outline of the maple tree in the moonlight. The next-door neighbor's porch light illuminated a portion of the street, revealing no one. The wind rustled the leaves, but that was all. A wave of nausea hit me. I felt profoundly unsettled, as though I was teetering on the brink of a horrifying discovery. Retreating back to the hallway, I collided with Carmen, who stood there in her robe, eyes wide with concern. "Landon, what's going on?" she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I heard something. Someone knocking on the window. She looked past me into the empty family room, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. "I heard a moaning sound," she admitted quietly. "That's what woke me up." We exchanged a weighted glance. Neither of us needed to say it. Something was definitely off. We returned to the bedroom, locking the door. It felt childish, but the sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. We curled up under the blankets, our hearts still racing. Eventually, a fitful sleep claimed us. Morning brought a cloudy dawn and an oppressive sense of dread. Over breakfast, Carmen and I avoided discussing the previous night's events in front of her parents. Mrs. Teresa had dark circles under her eyes, and Mr. Gabriel seemed preoccupied with something. I wondered if the house was tormenting them too. Perhaps they'd been hearing strange sounds or glimpsing fleeting shadows. Or maybe they were too steeped in grief to notice. After we finished eating, Carmen pulled me aside. "I can't take this anymore," she whispered. "Whatever is happening, we need to do something." I nodded. Maybe we should talk to someone? A counselor? A spiritual advisor? Carmen considered it. "I don't know. My mom's devoutly religious, but she doesn't believe in mediums or anything like that. And Dad," she trailed off, "he's been so withdrawn since Rena's funeral." An idea struck me. What if we just talk to your parents about it? Ask if they've experienced anything unusual. It might help us feel less alone. She agreed. Later that morning, as the four of us sat in the living room, Carmen and I on the couch, her parents each in separate chairs, I mustered the courage to bring it up. So, Mr. Gabriel, Mrs. Teresa, I began, clearing my throat. We've, noticed some odd things around the house. Doors creaking, strange noises at night. Have you heard anything like that? They exchanged a glance. Mrs. Teresa clasped her hands, knuckles whitening. I assumed it was just the old house settling, she said softly, not meeting my eyes. Mr. Gabriel sighed, rubbing his temples. To be honest, I thought I was imagining it. I've heard footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. And Teresa has been complaining of cold spots. Right, dear? She nodded timidly. Sometimes it feels like there's a draft passing by me, but all the windows are closed. And once I swear I smelled Rena's perfume in the upstairs corridor. My chest tightened, so it wasn't just Carmen and me. This was a shared experience, something the entire household was grappling with. Carmen reached for my hand, taking comfort in the knowledge that we weren't alone. Mrs. Teresa's eyes filled with tears. I miss her every day, but this is too much. An uncomfortable silence fell. Finally, Mr. Gabriel spoke. Look, I don't know about ghosts or spirits, but if Rena's presence is still here, maybe she's trying to tell us something. His voice wavered with emotion. Carmen squeezed my hand, her eyes pleading with me. We need to help her if we can, she said, voice trembling. Or at least understand what's happening. I felt a surge of resolve. Let's try to keep track of everything. Write down when and where we hear or see something. Maybe there's a pattern, I suggested. It sounded almost absurd, making a family chart of paranormal experiences, but everyone nodded, grateful for at least a small sense of control. That night, Carmen and I would be heading back to our own apartment. Before leaving, I wanted to make sure we had a plan in place. Mr. Gabriel fetched a small notebook and left it on the coffee table. We'll record what we notice, he said solemnly. And if it gets worse, we'll consider other options. A heavy weight settled in my gut. I couldn't shake the feeling that something more than Rena's spirit was at play here. The men who murdered her had been caught, yes, but the crime was so brutal that it felt as though a dark stain had been left on the family's life. Could that darkness have followed them home? By late afternoon, Carmen and I packed our overnight things, ready to head back to our place. Mrs. Teresa gave us both long, desperate hugs. Thank you for believing us, she whispered, and please be careful. She didn't elaborate on why we needed to be careful, but the implication lingered. If the presence was strong in this house, who was to say it couldn't follow us elsewhere? The drive back to our apartment was silent. Carmen stared out the window, her expression distant. Eventually, she murmured, I just hope Rena's at peace. That's all I want. I didn't have the heart to admit my growing suspicion that this was more than just a gentle haunting, but I vowed to do whatever it took to protect her family and to uncover the truth. Because something told me that the mysterious events in that house were building toward a climax, and I wasn't sure if any of us were ready for what came next. Our return to the apartment felt oddly surreal. Carmen and I had been so immersed in the strange happenings at her parents' house that stepping into our cozy, familiar living space was like entering another universe. The living room lamp cast a warm glow on the soft gray couch. The kitchen counters were cluttered with the usual mail and grocery receipts, and a faint lavender scent from Carmen's diffuser lingered in the air. It was comforting, but also unsettling, because I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brought something back with us. We unpacked in silence. Carmen headed for a quick shower, hoping to wash off the tension, while I busied myself by tidying the living room. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Teresa. "Just heard footsteps again. Your father is writing it down. We love you both." I replied with words of reassurance, though I felt hollow typing them. After Carmen emerged from the shower, looking marginally more relaxed, she joined me on the couch. We sat close, not speaking, just absorbing each other's presence. Finally, she spoke up. "Landon, how do we end this? Is there an end?" Her voice trembled at the edges, eyes glistening with held-back tears. My mind raced through possibilities. Exorcisms, seances, therapy, ignoring it altogether. None of them felt certain. "Maybe we need to confront it head-on," I offered gently. "If it's Rena, perhaps she just wants acknowledgement or closure. If it's something else..." I trailed off, not wanting to complete that thought. Carmen nodded, hugging her knees to her chest. "I'll talk to a spiritual counselor I know from the hospital," she said. "She's an older lady who volunteers sometimes. Everyone calls her Sister Harriet. She might have some advice." I agreed it was worth a try. Anything to feel less powerless. We flicked on the TV, attempting to distract ourselves with a sitcom, but the laughter track felt jarring and out of place given the weight on our shoulders. After a few minutes, we gave up and decided to call it a night. Around 2 a.m., I jerked awake from a nightmare. I'd been standing at the edge of a dark forest, hearing Rena's voice call my name from somewhere deep among the trees. Then 6 shadowy figures, faceless men, tall and looming, emerged, forming a silent circle around me. I woke up drenched in sweat, the duvet tangled around my legs. Carmen stirred beside me. "Bad dream?" she asked groggily. I nodded, heart still pounding. "Yeah, about Rena and those men." She scooted closer, wrapping an arm around me. "They can't hurt us anymore," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. The men were in prison, yes, but the terror they'd inflicted lived on. Even in memory, it had claws. The next morning, Carmen left early for her shift at the hospital. I lingered at home, compelled by a relentless desire to do something productive. I opened my laptop and began researching hauntings, spiritual attachments, and the concept of restless spirits. Most of what I found was sensationalist or contradictory. Some websites promoted smudging sage, others recommended salt lines, prayers, or even professional demonologists. Each link I clicked left me more confused than the last. Eventually, I texted Carmen. "Ask Sister Harriet if she has any time today." She replied that she'd see what she could do. While I waited, I scrolled further, stumbling onto a news site that covered local court cases. My blood ran cold when I saw a brief report about one of Rena's killers, a man named Matthew Rhodes, who'd filed for an appeal. A judge was set to review his case in a month. Anger and revulsion churned inside me. The idea that even one of those men might walk free someday was unthinkable. That afternoon, Carmen called me from the hospital break room. "I spoke with Sister Harriet," she announced. "She said she'd be willing to come to my parents' house tomorrow. She wants to pray, bless the space, talk to all of us about what we've been experiencing. She didn't promise a miracle, but she's open to listening." A flicker of hope lit in my chest. "That's great. Let's do it." We arranged to drive back to her parents' place the next day, bringing Sister Harriet along. The hours until then felt interminable. I distracted myself by going through some old photo albums Carmen kept in a shoebox. Images of her and Rena as children. Rena had been so full of life, eyes always alight with mischief or laughter. My heart ached at the unfairness of it all. When Carmen finally got home, the sun was setting behind the city skyline. We packed an overnight bag, anticipating we'd spend the night again at her parents'. Before leaving, Carmen hesitated at the door. "Do you feel like something's watching us, even here?" she asked, glancing around the apartment. A shiver threaded down my spine. I'd felt the same, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as though unseen eyes were on me. But I forced a smile. "Probably just our nerves," I said, though I didn't fully believe it. The drive was quiet, the sky a tapestry of deep purples fading into night. When we arrived at her parents' home, the house looked almost defiant, its windows reflecting the porch lights like vacant eyes. Carmen's mom and dad welcomed us with anxious relief. Mrs. Teresa had prepared tea, and Mr. Gabriel looked worn, as if he hadn't slept much. We settled in the living room, discussing the plan for Sister Harriet's visit. As the clock in the hall chimed 9 p.m., Carmen pulled out the notebook we'd talked about. Inside, her parents had scribbled times and dates. Footsteps at 2 a.m., cold spot near the dining room at noon, shadow in the upstairs hallway at 11 p.m. Reading through it made my skin crawl. Each entry felt like a puzzle piece of a larger, darker picture. Around 10 p.m., the lights flickered twice. We glanced at each other. Power surge or something else? Mr. Gabriel walked over to the fuse box, muttering about old wiring, but everything checked out. We tried to shake it off and carried on with small talk, though the sense of foreboding lingered in the air. At midnight, the house was enveloped in silence. Carmen and I decided to sleep in her old bedroom again. Mrs. Teresa and Mr. Gabriel retreated to theirs. I lay awake listening to the hush. Occasionally, I thought I heard soft tapping somewhere in the walls, but it was so faint that it could have been anything. Water pipes, rodents, my imagination. Then a crash shattered the quiet. Carmen and I bolted upright. It sounded like glass breaking coming from the hallway. I tore out of bed, adrenaline roaring in my veins. Carmen followed, flicking on the overhead light. We found a framed photo lying face down on the floor, shards of broken glass around it. The photo was of Rena, smiling brightly at her high school graduation. The nail in the wall was still firmly in place, so it hadn't simply fallen off. It was as if something had yanked it down. Mrs. Teresa rushed out of her bedroom, hand over her mouth. Mr. Gabriel followed, looking tense. The four of us stared at the broken frame in shocked silence. Carmen knelt to pick up the photograph itself, which remained intact, except for a slight tear along the edge. "Enough," Mr. Gabriel said, voice trembling with anger or fear, maybe both. "Whatever this is, it stops now." We cleared the broken glass, carefully placing Rena's photo in a fresh plastic sleeve to protect it. As we worked, I couldn't shake the sense that we were under a microscope, that something hovered in the corner of the hallway, invisible and malevolent. Once the mess was cleaned, Mr. Gabriel insisted we all gather in the living room. He handed out blankets so we could attempt to sleep there together, as if uniting as a family might ward off the ominous energy. We huddled in the semi-dark, the single table lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Carmen dozed fitfully against my shoulder. Her parents lay on the couch and recliner, eyes half shut but clearly awake. As for me, I couldn't sleep. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. I was convinced that if I closed my eyes, something would manifest in the periphery of my vision. In that oppressive stillness, I silently prayed for dawn and for Sister Harriet's arrival. If she had any spiritual power or insight, we desperately needed it. Because whatever was in this house wasn't content to merely haunt us. It was trying to break us. Each knock on the window, each footstep, each shattered frame, another crack in our composure. Eventually, the first pale light of dawn seeped through the curtains, and I realized I'd nodded off for a brief moment. Carmen stirred beside me, looking exhausted but determined. I squeezed her hand. Today was the day we'd seek help beyond ourselves. Maybe, just maybe, we'd find a way to put Rena's spirit at peace, or banish whatever else was tormenting this family. Little did we know just how harrowing that day would become. Sister Harriet arrived at 9 in the morning, just as a drizzle of rain began to tap against the windows. She was a petite woman in her late 60s, wearing a simple lavender cardigan over her dress. Despite her gentle appearance, something about her demeanor exuded quiet authority. Carmen introduced us briefly. "Sister Harriet, this is my boyfriend, Landon. My parents, Gabriel and Teresa." We each shook her hand. Her eyes were kind but searching, as though reading the emotional climate of the room. After a short exchange of pleasantries, we invited her to sit with us in the living room. The atmosphere was tense. The memory of the shattered photo frame still lingered. "I hear you've been experiencing unsettling occurrences," Sister Harriet began, voice gentle yet firm. "I'm here to listen first, then we'll see how I might help." Mr. Gabriel cleared his throat, glancing at his wife. "Our daughter, Rena, was murdered 3 months ago. We've been hearing noises, seeing shadows, feeling cold spots. We think it might be her ghost." Sister Harriet nodded sympathetically. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Sometimes grief itself can manifest in ways that seem supernatural. But if you truly believe there's a presence here, it's worth exploring." She asked us to recount specific incidents. One by one, we shared our experiences. The footsteps, the voices, the moaning in the night, the photo falling. She listened intently, occasionally making small notes in a worn leather notebook she'd brought. When it was my turn, I hesitated. I debated whether to mention that I'd heard Rena's voice call my name so distinctly. But I pushed past the discomfort, describing it in as much detail as I could manage. Carmen's hand found mine, lending silent support. Sister Harriet closed her notebook with a soft snap. "Thank you for sharing. It's clear you're all deeply affected. Now, I'm not an exorcist," she said gently. "But I do believe in prayer, in blessings, and in the power of God's grace. If Rena's spirit is here, it may be seeking comfort or closure. If something else is here, it may be feeding off your grief." A cold hush settled over us. The notion that a darker entity might be exploiting their sorrow felt like a cruel twist. Mrs. Teresa dabbed her eyes with a tissue, and Carmen's jaw tightened. Sister Harriet stood. "Let's walk through the house," she suggested. "I'd like to pray in each room. If you feel comfortable, join me. If not, just remain here." We opted to accompany her. She started in the family room, sprinkling holy water and reciting a soft prayer. The words seemed to vibrate in the air, carrying an undercurrent of urgency. From there, we moved to the dining room, kitchen, and finally the hallway. As we progressed, a subtle tension rose. By the time we reached the upstairs corridor, I felt my muscles coiled like springs, ready to snap. She paused outside Rena's old bedroom, looking at Mr. Gabriel and Mrs. Teresa. "Do you mind if I go inside?" she asked. Mrs. Teresa hesitated, then nodded. "Please do." We entered the room, which had been left mostly untouched since Rena's death. A few stuffed animals lined the shelves, and pictures of Rena's friends were pinned to a corkboard. The air felt thick, like walking into a space preserved in time. Sister Harriet bowed her head and prayed softly. Then she placed a hand on Rena's desk. "Rena," she murmured, "if your spirit is here, know that you are loved. Know that your family mourns you, but they also want you to find peace." A sudden chill swept through the room, causing me to shiver involuntarily. Carmen's eyes widened, and Mrs. Teresa clutched her husband's arm. We all felt it, a wave of cold that had no logical source. Sister Harriet continued her prayer, voice unwavering. Finally, the chill dissipated as quickly as it had come. We finished upstairs and returned to the living room. Sister Harriet exhaled, looking tired. "I've done what I can," she said softly. "I offered prayers and blessings. Sometimes that's enough to encourage a restless spirit to move on. But I also sense there's a heavier shadow here, something tethered to the tragedy your family endured." Mr. Gabriel's brow furrowed. "What do we do about that?" he asked, voice trembling. Sister Harriet's gaze was compassionate but solemn. "You must confront it directly, acknowledge your pain, and refuse to let malevolence thrive on your grief. Continue to pray, if that aligns with your beliefs. Keep each other close. If the activity persists, you might consider more specialized help. But often, unity and unwavering resolve can dispel darkness." Her words hung in the air like a riddle. We thanked her, and she departed with quiet dignity. Carmen walked her out, and they exchanged a few private words on the porch. When Carmen returned, she looked both heartened and apprehensive. "What did she say?" I asked. Carmen sighed. She said this might not be a one-time fix. We have to be vigilant. The rest of the day was strangely calm. We half expected more supernatural disturbances, but the hours passed uneventfully. We shared an early dinner, exchanging hesitant smiles, almost daring to hope. That night, as we prepared to sleep, I felt a subdued tension, as if we'd merely forced something to retreat for a moment, not banished it. Carmen and I once again occupied her old bedroom. Exhaustion took hold, and we managed to drift off. Sometime in the small hours, I startled awake. Darkness enveloped the room, broken only by the faint luminescence of the street lamp outside. My throat felt tight, my body rigid, as though gripped by an unseen force. My eyes darted around the darkened space, trying to discern the cause of my dread. Then, I sensed movement near the foot of the bed. A shape, darker than the surrounding night, seemed to hover there. My pulse thundered, sweat chilling my skin. Carmen slept beside me, oblivious. I wanted to call her name, but my voice refused to cooperate. I could only stare as the shape elongated, stretching upward, an impossible outline that flickered like a shadow cast by candlelight. Suddenly, a faint whisper filled the room. Words I couldn't quite make out. It sounded like the hush of many voices overlapping, a tortured murmur. My heart pounded wildly, and I squeezed my eyes shut, silently praying for it to vanish. When I opened them again, the shape was gone. The room was still, the air thick with dread. I sat up, trembling, and flicked on the bedside lamp. Carmen stirred awake, blinking in confusion. "What is it?" she murmured. My voice shook. I thought I saw something. A shadow." Carmen's face paled. She didn't question me further. Instead, she reached for my hand, and we held on to each other until morning light crept through the blinds. Any illusions that Sister Harriet's visit would solve everything were shattered. The darkness that clung to this house, and perhaps to us, was still very much alive. And it seemed to be growing bolder, more tangible. I couldn't help but wonder if it wanted more than fear, if it desired some form of sacrifice or retribution tied to Rena's murder. The thought terrified me. In the harsh clarity of morning, as we recounted the event to her parents, we resolved not to give up. Sister Harriet's words echoed in my mind. You must confront it directly. But how do you confront a shadow that warps reality itself, that drips poison into your dreams and turns photographs into shattered glass? None of us knew, but we had to try. Because if we didn't, it felt like this malignant force would continue to feed on our pain until it consumed us completely. The following day, Carmen had to return to the hospital for an evening shift. Despite my own reservations, I offered to remain at her parents' house a bit longer, partly to keep them company, partly to see if I could uncover any answers. Mr. Gabriel was grateful. Mrs. Teresa still looked on edge, her eyes darting nervously at every small noise. Carmen left around midday, promising to text or call when she could. That left me alone with her parents, who seemed relieved yet slightly guilty for depending on me. We spent the afternoon in a semblance of normalcy, Mr. Gabriel working on a jigsaw puzzle in the dining room, Mrs. Teresa knitting a scarf in her favorite armchair. I skimmed through the local newspaper, trying to ignore the unsettled feeling in my gut. Around 4 p.m., the landline phone rang, a jarring sound in the quiet house. Mrs. Teresa answered, listened briefly, then motioned for me to pick up the extension. "It's someone for you," she mouthed. Puzzled, I grabbed the phone. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, raspy like they were recovering from a bad cold. "Landon Hayes?" the caller asked. "This is he," I replied. "Who's this?" The person hesitated. "You don't know me, but I have information about Rena's case, about the men who—" The voice broke off momentarily. "Look, I don't want to give my name over the phone. Can you meet me downtown? At the fountain near the old courthouse. 5 o'clock. My pulse quickened. What is this about? They're filing appeals. It's not just one of them. It's more. I can't say more right now." The line went dead. I slowly lowered the receiver, my heart thudding. Why would someone call here, specifically asking for me about the appeals? Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a cruel prank, but a deeper instinct insisted otherwise. Summoning my courage, I relayed the conversation to Mr. Gabriel and Mrs. Teresa, concern etched across their faces. "I don't like this," Mrs. Teresa said, fingers twisting in her knitting. "It could be dangerous." Mr. Gabriel frowned, setting down a puzzle piece. "It could also be our chance to ensure justice is served. But you should be careful, Landon." I glanced at the clock. It was already nearing 4:15 p.m. If I was going to make it downtown by 5, I needed to leave soon. After a brief internal debate, I decided to go. Something about this felt urgent, like it could connect to the darkness plaguing us. 15 minutes later, I pulled up to the old courthouse, an imposing structure with fluted columns and a chipped stone facade. The fountain out front was a local landmark, a circular basin with a statue of a robed figure pouring water from an urn. People milled about, office workers on their way home, a few couples strolling, a street musician playing violin. I scanned the area, unsure who I was looking for. Then I noticed a slight figure in a hooded jacket, leaning against the fountain's edge. They caught my eye and beckoned me over. As I approached, I saw it was a woman with pale skin, dark hair pinned into a messy bun beneath the hood. She looked around anxiously, as if expecting to be followed. "You came," she said, her voice matching the raspy timbre from the phone. "Thank you." "Who are you?" I asked, trying to maintain a polite but guarded tone. Her gaze flicked around. "Call me Ava. I used to be involved with one of those 6 men. We dated before before what happened." Her voice quavered. "I've been trying to atone ever since." A wave of uneasy sympathy hit me. "So, what do you know about the appeals?" She leaned in, keeping her voice low. 3 of them are filing. They claim new evidence suggests they weren't at the scene or that they were coerced. It's all lies, obviously. But they have a lawyer who's relentless, and they might succeed in reducing their sentences, if not walking free. My stomach churned with rage. That's unthinkable. She nodded, eyes glimmering with guilt and fear. "I know. I also know that one of them, a man named Paul Winston, was involved in something dark, occult stuff if you believe rumors. I heard him brag once, saying that taking a life under certain conditions binds the spirit. I never thought he'd actually act on it. But now..." She shuddered. Occult rumors. My mind raced back to the terrifying shadow I'd witnessed, to Rena's voice, to the oppressive sense of malevolence in the house. Could it be connected? The thought made my skin crawl. Eva continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I can't prove any of this in court, but I felt you should know. If this man is seeking release, he might try something. A ritual, or maybe he's tied to that darkness around Rena. I don't know." I struggled to remain composed. "Why tell me of all people?" "Because you're close to the family, and because..." She paused, her voice trembling. "I dream about Rena, every night. She calls out, telling me to help. It's driving me insane, but maybe I can do some good now." Tears shone in her eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner." Speechless, I stood there, the cool breeze ruffling my hair. My mind whirled with possibilities and dread. Finally, I managed. "Thank you for telling me. What do you expect me to do?" Eva glanced at the courthouse. "Fight the appeals however you can. Bring in the best lawyer, the best evidence. Make noise with the media if you have to. These men can't be allowed back on the streets." She slipped a small envelope into my hand. "This has a few documents and a list of people who might be willing to testify about the group's threats and strange beliefs. Use it carefully." Without another word, she turned and walked away, melting into the crowd. I stood there, envelope clutched in my hand, feeling as though my world had tilted. The men who'd killed Rena weren't just murderers. They were possibly dabbling in something vile and arcane. And if Paul Winston had boasted about binding spirits, maybe Rena's restless presence, along with that ominous shadow, was a direct result of their twisted act. I rushed back to my car, mind spinning with adrenaline. Before driving off, I peeked inside the envelope. There were typed notes about rumored rituals, references to strange symbols, plus phone numbers and addresses of individuals with partial knowledge of Winston's activities. It was a grim puzzle that hinted at something bigger than a simple court appeal. On the drive home, I called Carmen's cell, leaving a hurried voicemail. "We need to talk as soon as possible. Something's come up about Rena's case. Call me back." By the time I reached her parents' house, darkness had fallen. The living room lamp glowed warmly through the window, a false promise of security. I stepped inside, my pulse still racing. Mrs. Teresa and Mr. Gabriel were waiting, their anxiety plain. I told them about Eva's warning, choosing my words carefully. Mrs. Teresa's face went pale, and Mr. Gabriel let out a growl of frustration. "They took our daughter, and now they're trying to get out?" He spat, tears shining in his eyes. I nodded, my own anger flaring. Then I hesitated, deciding whether to mention the occult angle. Finally, I whispered. One of them was rumored to be involved in dark rituals. That might tie into the strange things happening here. Mr. Gabriel stared at me, a mix of skepticism and fear dancing in his gaze. Mrs. Teresa clutched his hand. "We'll do whatever it takes," she said, voice shaky but resolute. "We can't let them go free. And if they've chained Rena's spirit somehow, we have to break that chain." We spent the next hour poring over the documents Ava had given me, discussing potential next steps, legal battles, contacting a detective we trusted, maybe even speaking to Sister Harriet again. Each idea felt like flailing in the dark, but at least it was something. As the night deepened, an unspoken dread seeped into the corners of the house. We were stirring the pot, delving into secrets that might provoke the forces lurking just beyond our sight. Little did we realize just how far those forces were willing to go to protect their evil handiwork, and how easily a single misstep could plunge us into unimaginable terror. That same night, a thunderstorm rolled in unexpectedly, lightning illuminating the sky in jagged streaks. The electricity in the air seemed to magnify the tension in the house. Mr. Gabriel paced the living room, phone in hand, trying to contact an old friend who worked as a private investigator. Mrs. Teresa sat in the recliner, trembling as the thunder rattled the windows. I hovered by the couch, reading over the cryptic notes Ava had passed to me. One line stood out. "Blood anchors the spirit, forging a path for their torment." It was scrawled in shaky handwriting, attributed to an anonymous source who claimed to have overheard Paul Winston. The idea that Rena's very blood had been used in some vile ritual made my stomach churn. Could that explain why her spirit seemed unable to rest? My phone rang, startling me. I scrambled to answer, seeing it was Carmen. "Hey," I said, my voice taut. "I just finished with a patient," she said, sounding equally tense. "What's going on?" I quickly filled her in on Ava's revelations. There was a pause on the line. "Oh my God," she finally said, voice cracking. "I knew those men were monsters, but I don't even have words." "What time do you get off?" I asked. "Not until midnight," she replied reluctantly. "But I'll come straight there afterward." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the living room with stark white light. "Be careful," I murmured. "This storm is intense and I don't know. I have a bad feeling." She promised to drive safely and hung up. I relayed the update to her parents, who both nodded with relief. Having Carmen here would help bolster our morale. As the storm raged, the lights flickered. The digital clock on the mantel reset with a beep. Rain battered the roof, and the wind hissed through the eaves. The occasional roar of thunder felt like an ominous drum roll, as if nature itself was bracing for some macabre performance. Mr. Gabriel finally got through to his investigator friend. They spoke in hushed tones while Mrs. Teresa and I listened in. After a few minutes, Mr. Gabriel relayed the conversation. He says he'll look into the appeals, see if there's any chance these men have a shot at being released. He also wants to know more about these occult rumors. If there's any concrete evidence, it might sway a judge or at least bring attention to their malice. "Concrete evidence," I echoed, glancing down at the notes. Much of it was hearsay, rumor, innuendo. Nothing that would hold up in a courtroom. Still, shining a public light on this might disrupt their plans, assuming they indeed had more sinister plans. An hour crept by, the storm unrelenting. I could feel the tension coiling in my muscles. Restless, so I decided to fetch us some fresh tea. Heading into the kitchen, I passed the threshold and froze. A chill swept over my entire body, familiar, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. My breath caught in my throat. The overhead light flickered, revealing a faint shape near the window, translucent, vaguely human. I could discern the outline of a face, slender shoulders, and hair that draped around the form. My heart hammered. "Rena?" I whispered, voice quivering. The silhouette seemed to shift, its head tilting as though acknowledging me. Then a burst of lightning flashed, and in that searing moment of illumination, the figure vanished. In its place, the kitchen window rattled violently from the wind. I stood there, pulse pounding, uncertain if I'd just witnessed Rena's spirit or some trick of the storm. I hurriedly brewed the tea, my hands trembling as I poured hot water over the tea bags. Balancing the mugs on a tray, I returned to the living room. My face must have betrayed my distress because Mrs. Teresa placed a hand over mine. "Did you see something?" she asked softly. I hesitated, then nodded. "I think it was her, or a part of her." Mrs. Teresa's eyes welled. Mr. Gabriel swallowed hard. None of us knew what to say. We sipped tea in silence, the bitter brew doing little to soothe our nerves. Around midnight, headlights swept across the living room window. Carmen had arrived. The front door creaked open, and she rushed inside, soaked from the downpour. Her eyes were wide, a mixture of adrenaline and worry. "I could barely see the road," she exclaimed, peeling off her wet jacket. We gave her a quick update, telling her about the flickering lights, the calls, and my possible sighting of Rena. She listened intently, her hand clutching mine. "We need a plan," she finally said. "We can't just sit here waiting for something terrible to happen." Before we could respond, the room went pitch black. The lights died, leaving us in total darkness. A collective gasp filled the air. Mr. Gabriel fumbled for a flashlight, while I scrambled for my phone. The storm had apparently knocked out the power. Illuminated by the bluish glow of our phone screens, we huddled together, waiting for our eyes to adjust. Thunder growled in the distance. Then, with horrifying clarity, we heard a soft thud from the hallway. Mr. Gabriel flashed his light toward the sound. The beam revealed a trail of wet footprints on the floor, leading from the front door into the hallway. But Carmen had just come in through the living room entrance, and none of us were currently walking around. My blood ran cold. Someone, or something, was moving through the house. Clutching the flashlight, Mr. Gabriel took a tentative step forward. "Stay behind me," he warned, voice tight. We crept into the hallway. Each footstep echoed ominously. Another flash of lightning lit the corridor, revealing the footprints continuing toward the family room. "This can't be real," Mrs. Teresa whispered, tears in her voice. "There's no one else here." Yet we followed the trail, hearts in our throats. The family room stood empty, the curtains drawn. Rain battered the window. The footprints ended abruptly near the couch, as though they'd simply vanished. A fresh jolt of lightning revealed something etched into the condensation on the window pane. A single word, scrawled in spidery letters, "Mine." My breath caught. Carmen let out a stifled sob. Mr. Gabriel pressed his back against the wall, shining the flashlight on the eerie message. Mrs. Teresa trembled, leaning on the recliner for support. "What does that mean?" Carmen managed, voice quivering. I swallowed hard, remembering Ava's words about binding spirits. If Paul Winston had performed some twisted ritual, maybe in his delusion, he believed he owned Rena's spirit. Or worse, some entity believed it now claimed her soul. The idea sent waves of revulsion through me. A colossal thunderclap shook the house, and we heard the unmistakable crash of a door slamming upstairs. Adrenaline surged. We raced to the staircase, shining the flashlight upward. "Stay close," Mr. Gabriel repeated, his voice strained. Step by cautious step, we ascended. On the landing, the corridor stretched in darkness. The door to Rena's old room stood ajar, but no light emanated from within. Another flash of lightning strobed through the hallway window, revealing that Rena's door was the one that slammed shut, except now it was open again. I felt Carmen's hand tighten around mine. We inched closer. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. The beam of the flashlight swept into Rena's room. It was empty, save for her dresser drawers pulled out halfway, clothes strewn across the floor. That hadn't been the case earlier. Mrs. Teresa let out a soft wail, her grip on Mr. Gabriel's arm trembling. "Who did this?" she cried. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the room, snuffing out the flashlight. We were plunged into blackness. I scrabbled for my phone, hands shaking. Lightning flashed, exposing a silhouette near the dresser. Tall, angular, an inky mass that seemed to waver in the flicker of light. It resembled the shape I'd glimpsed before, but more defined, more menacing. Carmen screamed, and the figure vanished with the next bolt of lightning. In the darkness, we huddled together, fear spiking our veins. Another crash of thunder, another flash of light, and the figure was gone, leaving behind only the swirling emptiness of the storm-lit room. Finally, Mr. Gabriel's flashlight flickered back on. We scanned the space, but we were alone. Alone, except for the disarray and the suffocating sense of dread. Something had invaded Rena's room, whether it was her spirit or a dark force masquerading as her. We couldn't be sure. All we knew was that it was growing bolder, more hostile. We retreated downstairs, hearts still pounding, and gathered in the living room again. The footprints, the broken dresser, the word "mine" etched on the window, these were signs of a battle lines being drawn. The storm outside felt like a harbinger, each flash of lightning revealing we were not in control of this situation. That night, none of us dared to sleep. We sat in the flickering candlelight after the flashlight batteries drained, half expecting the walls to come alive. At some point, Mrs. Teresa began quietly praying, tears rolling down her cheeks. Mr. Gabriel joined in, voice trembling. Carmen and I clasped hands, listening to the raging wind and praying dawn would chase away the darkness. But deep inside, I feared daylight would only bring a temporary reprieve. The true confrontation loomed, and with it, the terrible possibility that the malevolence born from Rena's brutal murder might claim more than just her spirit. It might come for us all. By the time the first gray light of dawn broke over the horizon, we were beyond exhausted. The storm had died down, leaving branches scattered across the yard and puddles reflecting the pale sky. Carmen and I exchanged weary glances, both of us feeling hollowed out by the night's events. Once the sun rose higher, Mr. Gabriel ventured outside to check for damage. Mrs. Teresa busied herself in the kitchen, making a large pot of coffee as if her life depended on it. Meanwhile, Carmen and I sat at the dining room table, reviewing Ava's notes once more, determined to find some clue or solution. "Look at this," Carmen said, pointing to a scribbled line. "Ritual location: abandoned orchard, south of highway." She tapped the page. Eva mentioned that Winston bragged about performing ceremonies at some orchard. What if that's where, whatever this is, got anchored? My eyes flickered over the text. If Rena was taken there, or even if just some part of a ritual was performed there, it could be significant, I agreed. It might be the source. Carmen chewed her lip. "What do we do with that? Call the police? They've already gone over the crime scenes thoroughly, haven't they?" "Yes, but they might not have known to look for anything occult," I reasoned. "It might be worth investigating ourselves, but we shouldn't go alone." A voice behind us cleared its throat. We turned to see Mr. Gabriel, his face etched with a mix of grief and resolve. "I'll come with you," he offered. "And if we need backup, we'll call the police or the private investigator." I glanced at Carmen, who gave a slight nod. Mrs. Teresa, overhearing our conversation, stepped forward. "Promise me you'll be careful," she pleaded, eyes filled with fear. "We will," Carmen assured her, hugging her mother. "But we have to do something." We spent the morning gathering what little information we could. I tried calling Ava, but her phone went to voicemail. We left a message, asking for more specifics about the orchard's location. Meanwhile, Mr. Gabriel called the private investigator again, explaining our intentions. The investigator advised caution, but offered to meet us near the highway if we wanted. Around noon, we finally received a text from Ava. "Orchard is 3 miles south of exit 22. Big rusted gate with orchard sign. Be safe." That was all we had to go on. Carmen, Mr. Gabriel, and I piled into my car. Mrs. Teresa stayed behind, too shaken to leave the house. The drive felt surreal, sunlight streaming through the windows, the autumn leaves shining in burnt oranges and reds, a stark contrast to the dread churning in my stomach. At exit 22, we turned onto a narrow country road that twisted through fields and patches of woodland. Eventually, we spotted a rusted gate with a dilapidated sign reading Sundale Orchard. The place had clearly been abandoned for years. Weeds grew waist-high, and the path beyond the gate was overgrown with tangled brambles. My pulse quickened as we parked on the shoulder. The air felt unnaturally still, as if the world were holding its breath. We got out of the car, scanning the area. "Should we call the investigator now?" I asked softly. Mr. Gabriel shook his head. "Let's see if we can find anything first. No sense in dragging him out here for nothing." We climbed over the gate with a bit of effort. Carmen nearly tripped, but Mr. Gabriel caught her arm. A battered dirt path led into the orchard, rows of gnarled apple trees that looked like skeletal sentinels in the midday sun. Dry leaves crunched under our feet as we ventured deeper. The silence pressed in on us. My senses felt heightened, every rustle of brush sending my nerves into overdrive. After about 10 minutes of walking, we came upon a small clearing. Remnants of charred wood lay scattered in a circle, along with tattered black cloth and something resembling melted wax. My stomach flipped. "This looks like a fire pit," Carmen whispered, her voice trembling. "Could it be?" Kneeling, Mr. Gabriel examined the charred remains. "This is definitely a makeshift fire site," he confirmed. "The cloth could have been part of some ritual garment, and the wax might be from candles." I crouched to get a closer look. A foul stench hit me, rotten yet chemical. My eyes watered. I used a stick to poke at the debris, and my heart lurched when I uncovered a small metal pendant. It was rusted, shaped like an upside-down cross, overlaid with strange symbols. My gut told me this was no ordinary trinket. Carmen covered her mouth, her eyes locked on the pendant. "Landon, this has to be connected to Winston's ritual," she said shakily. Suddenly, a breeze swept through the orchard, carrying with it a low moan that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The trees creaked ominously, their twisted branches appearing to reach for us. I felt that familiar chill, reminiscent of what I'd experienced in the kitchen. Mr. Gabriel stood, tension radiating from him. "We've seen enough. Let's get out of here. I'll notify the investigator and the police. They need to look at this." We turned to leave, but the orchard seemed to resist us. The path we'd followed felt different, as though the rows of trees had shifted. Carmen gripped my arm, her breath quickening. "Where's the gate?" she asked, a hint of panic coloring her voice. Trying to stay calm, I pointed in the direction we'd come from. "It should be this way," I said, though my voice wavered. We trudged through the orchard, forcing ourselves between the rows of trees. Branches snagged our clothes. Leaves rustled with malicious intensity. After 10 minutes, we still hadn't found the gate or even the main path. Anxiety spiked. Were we disoriented, or was something leading us astray? Finally, we spotted a break in the fence, not the gate we'd climbed, but enough to scramble through. As we neared, I heard a low, guttural growl from behind. My heart slammed in my chest. I spun around, finding nothing but swaying branches. Carmen let out a shuddering breath. "Did you—" "I heard it," I whispered, eyes scanning the orchard. Mr. Gabriel's face was pale. None of us needed to confirm it further. We bolted for the gap in the fence, practically tumbling out onto a small side road. Breathing heavily, we collapsed against the car's trunk once we circled back around. My hands shook uncontrollably as I gripped the pendant we'd found. Carmen was crying softly, and Mr. Gabriel pressed a hand to his forehead, looking like he might collapse. That place is cursed," he managed through gritted teeth. Without hesitation, I called the private investigator, giving him the orchard's location and telling him to bring the police. "We found evidence of a ritual site," I said, my voice trembling. "We barely made it out. You need to hurry." He promised to alert the authorities. We sped away from that forsaken orchard, hearts pounding. As the distance grew, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For an instant, I thought I saw a black silhouette standing among the trees, watching us depart. Then we rounded a bend, and the orchard vanished from view. The drive back to the house was silent, each of us lost in our own tumultuous thoughts. My mind replayed the orchard scene, the charred circle, the pendant, the unearthly growl. If that was where Rena's spirit had been bound, we'd just ventured into the heart of the malevolence trailing us. We finally pulled into the driveway, and Mrs. Teresa rushed out to meet us. She took one look at our pale faces and let out a startled sob. "What happened?" Mr. Gabriel hugged her tight, voice quavering. "We found something horrifying. The police are on their way there now." Mrs. Teresa stared at us in dread. Is Rena trapped in that place?" None of us answered. The question alone was unbearable to consider. Instead, we guided her inside, trying to offer what little comfort we could. That night, the orchard's memory clung to us like a malignant shadow. We could only hope that involving the authorities might sever whatever tie Winston or the others had created there. but my instincts screamed that this was far from over. We'd poked a hornet's nest, stirring the evil that had latched onto Rena's memory. And if Winston or his cohorts sensed our interference, they might escalate their efforts, from behind bars or beyond. I just prayed we hadn't put ourselves in the crosshairs of something we couldn't possibly understand or defeat. The next few days passed in a blur of dread and anxious waiting. The police, accompanied by the private investigator, combed through the orchard and confirmed we hadn't imagined things. They found evidence of multiple fires, burnt candles, and obscure symbols etched into the tree trunks. It was enough for them to suspect occult activity related to Rena's murder, but not enough to bring fresh charges against the imprisoned men, unless they could prove direct involvement. Meanwhile, word leaked about the orchard's discovery. Local newspapers ran headlines about a cult connection to a high-profile homicide, stirring public outrage and fear. The prosecutor's office hinted they might use the orchard evidence to counter any appeals from the convicted men, trying to paint a picture of just how depraved these killers were. But legal proceedings moved slowly, and we all felt like we were sitting ducks in a swirling storm of rumor and half-truths. Back at Carmen's parents' house, the atmosphere remained charged with restless energy. Small disturbances plagued us, lights flickering at random, doors drifting open on their own, and an overwhelming sense that we were never truly alone. Carmen and I took turns staying overnight, wanting to support her parents and each other. One late afternoon, I caught Carmen standing in the family room, staring at a photo of Rena on the mantle, her graduation picture, now placed in a new frame after the original one shattered. "I can't believe she might be stuck," Carmen whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "All because of those monsters." Gently, I placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're doing everything we can," I said, though I felt as powerless as ever. She turned to me, face set with determination. "I want to try something. Sister Harriet said we have to confront this directly. So let's do it. Let's call out to Rena, or whatever is holding her. Right here, right now." My stomach twisted. The idea of inviting that presence to manifest felt dangerous, but Carmen was resolute. She called her parents into the living room, explaining that we wanted to attempt a kind of direct communication to demand answers or release. They agreed, albeit nervously. We sat in a circle on the living room floor, a single candle flickering in the center. The curtains were drawn, the overhead lights turned off. Outside, dusk settled over the neighborhood. Carmen cleared her throat, her voice trembling but firm. "Rena, if you're here, if you can hear us, we're asking you to come forward. We love you. We want you at peace." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a subtle shift in the air, a drop in temperature. My arms prickled with goosebumps. Mrs. Teresa gasped softly. Mr. Gabriel swallowed hard. Carmen licked her lips and continued, "Rena, if something is preventing you from moving on, we stand against it. Show us what we need to do." The candle flame wavered, nearly snuffing out. A breeze stirred around us, even though every window was shut. Then came a faint voice, or what felt like a voice, rustling through the room like a sigh. I couldn't discern the words, but the sound carried an unmistakable sadness. Mrs. Teresa broke into quiet sobs, and Mr. Gabriel wrapped an arm around her. I shivered, remembering the orchard and the black silhouette we'd seen in Rena's bedroom. Was that overshadowing her now? Silencing her? Or was she struggling to break free? Carmen spoke again, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Rena, please. We need a sign. something we can do to help you find peace." Suddenly, the flame of the candle shot upward, a bright and twisting flare that made us recoil. The scent of burning wax intensified, and I thought I saw the shape of a hand flicker across the wall, as though cast by an unseen figure. My heart thundered in my chest. Then the flame returned to normal, and the chill receded. For a long moment, none of us spoke. We exchanged terrified, hopeful glances. Was that her?" Mr. Gabriel finally whispered. Carmen exhaled shakily. "I think so. Maybe she's trying to tell us that the orchard is key, or that we need to do something more to break this hold." Just then, the landline phone rang, jolting us from our circle. Mr. Gabriel scrambled to answer, while we blew out the candle and turned on a lamp. Our eyes were still adjusting to the light when he returned, looking rattled. "That was the prosecutor's office," he said. "They just got word that one of the men, Paul Winston, died in prison last night. Some kind of sudden medical event. They didn't give details." A stunned silence fell over the room. Carmen's eyes widened. "Winston is dead? The one rumored to have performed that ritual?" Mr. Gabriel nodded, still processing the news. Mrs. Teresa pressed a hand to her chest, her face drained of color. I couldn't help but recall Ava's warning that Winston was dangerous, that he'd boasted about binding Rena's spirit. Had his death freed her? Or had it enraged something even darker? We were all too shaken to guess. That night, an uncanny stillness enveloped the house. The flickering lights stopped, and the footsteps in the hallway ceased. It was as though a door had been closed, or a tether severed. For the first time in what felt like ages, we slept without interruption. In the morning, a bittersweet calm settled in. Over breakfast, we discussed the possibility that Winston's death might have broken the final link of the ritual. Carmen quietly mentioned the orchard again, wondering if we should go back one last time. Maybe hold a small memorial for Rena there, to symbolically reclaim that ground from whoever had defiled it. Her parents hesitated, but agreed. Midday, we drove once more to that rusted gate, only this time accompanied by a sense of cautious hope. The orchard felt different. No oppressive stillness, no sense of being watched. The sun filtered through the twisted branches, revealing a landscape of fallen apples and wild undergrowth. The charred circle was still there, but the stench was gone. We gathered in the clearing. Carmen set down a framed photograph of Rena, the same graduation picture that had fallen in the hallway. Mr. Gabriel lit a small white candle, and Mrs. Teresa softly recited a prayer of farewell. I placed flowers on the ground, heart heavy yet oddly calm. Then, as if carried on the breeze, we heard the faintest whisper, "Thank you." This time, the voice was unmistakably Rena's. It was as if she was standing beside us, free at last. Tears flowed freely from all of us. The orchard's gloom seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet tranquility. Carmen and I exchanged tearful smiles. Mr. Gabriel held his wife close, both of them weeping. We stood there, letting the sun warm our faces, believing that Rena was finally at peace. With Winston gone, maybe the darkness he'd called upon had lost its anchor. In the weeks that followed, the appeals for the other men lost much of their momentum. Public sentiment was vehemently against them, especially with the revelation of an occult link. The nightmares in Carmen's house ceased. No more eerie footsteps, no more chilling voices. Life began to shift back toward something resembling normalcy, albeit scarred by tragedy and the memory of supernatural horrors. Carmen and I grew closer through the ordeal, our bond forged in fire. We talked about the wedding we'd once dreamed of, and though we knew the loss of Rina would forever cast a shadow, we felt a renewed determination to live, truly live, in her honor. On a rainy autumn evening, as I sat alone in the family room, I turned on the TV just for background noise. My mind wandered to that day I first heard Rina's voice, calling my name so clearly it made my heart stop. A nostalgic ache tugged at me. Yet I also felt a sense of closure. Rina wasn't sitting beside me physically, but I believed she was finally free. I switched off the TV and gazed at the empty cushion. No ghostly whisper came, and strangely, that silence was comforting. I rose, stepped out to the porch, and watched the rain. For the first time in months, I felt no urgency to look over my shoulder, no dread of unseen eyes lurking in the dark. Rina's story had reached its conclusion, not in the way any of us wanted, but in a final, merciful release from the horror that had ensnared her. As I stood there, raindrops pattering on the roof, I silently thanked her for that one clear moment when she'd called my name. It was a reminder that even in death, love finds a way to speak. And so, our long nightmare ended as gently as it had begun abruptly, leaving us changed but hopeful. The orchard lay behind us, a scar on the landscape of our memories. The house was quiet now, the air no longer thick with ghosts, and Rina, wherever she was, had given us the gift of resolution. A faint but powerful whisper in the autumn breeze. Thank you.